Hello, everyone. Today we have Kim Mack Rosenberg with us. Today we're so excited.
Very excited.
I can hardly contain myself. We've worked with Kim for years, and we've just been trying to get her on the podcast. She's been very willing, but it's just like the scheduling ordeal, right? We're all busy. So Kim is with us today, and Kim is the managing partner of Mack Rosenberg Law, formerly Bauer Law. Some of you guys have, if you've heard, we've talked about Jody and Kim. Well, this is the Kim of Jody and Kim. Let's see, are you still located in Princeton, New Jersey, Kim?
I still am in Princeton, New Jersey.
Okay. Kim was a litigator focusing on insurance coverage, products liability, and other complex matters with a large national law firm based in New York City for approximately 20 years. And then she joined Bauer Law in 2016 and became a partner in 2019. When Bauer Law began, the firm primarily represented individuals and families in disputes with healthcare payers for coverage related to ABA therapy, other ASD-related therapies, and other medical mental health services. However, the firm quickly branched into prosecuting individual and class-wide impact litigation for families of children with ASD arising out of state and federal mental health parity law violations, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and other healthcare and discrimination laws. Although her work representing individuals with medical and mental health disabilities is ongoing, Kim primarily works with ABA therapy providers in all practice-related matters, including, but not limited to, matters involving healthcare, compliance advice, payer disputes, and licensing issues. She regularly defends providers against audits, recoupment, and fraud allegations, and also advises them on day-to-day ABA operation issues. On behalf of her ABA provider clients, Kim conducts internal audits and prepares and trains clients on documentation, coding compliance, and appeals and audit processes. And she further assists her provider clients in creating individualized performance improvement plans and regularly interacts with payer quality control and billing departments. Kim regularly lectures and provides workshops and trainings of interest for ABA provider associations, organizations, and presents at conferences nationwide and internationally to both parents and healthcare providers. She's also a longtime advocate for the autism spectrum disorder and disability communities, and regularly interacts with a number of nonprofits dedicated to these communities. Kim has worked closely with and served in leadership positions for a variety of ASD-related organizations, including the Elizabeth Burt Center for Autism Law and Advocacy, and the New York Metro chapter and the National Autism Association, among other organizations. She is an author, editor of 3 books, lectures, has appeared in the media. Kim maintains active licenses to practice law in New York and New Jersey, as well as before a number of federal courts. She serves clients around the United States and is to assist them in resolving disputes with insurance payers and funders. Kim, you are just a goddess in this field. So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for all of your work for the autism community.
Thank you for that.
And thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. I'm glad we could finally make this work.
Yes.
It's all, and thank you for helping us, in our time of need, right? Like, I remember that first audit we got, right, and we sent in all the paperwork ourselves, and I sent in way more than I should have, and they came back and said, everything's wrong, you owe us $140,000, and it's like, oh no, like, I swear I was gonna have a heart attack, and that's when we met you. So
are you sure it was in my mind we owed like 750?
No.
We owed like $1 million. Like it was such a big deal.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
That's a big number, right? That's a big number for, especially, and we see big, we see bigger, we see smaller, but it also, it's the scale of your business too, right? So, and what your cash flow looks like, and what of that amount is really recoupable, because oftentimes it's not all, and if it is all or close to all, can you negotiate a smaller amount? Because oftentimes you can.
Yeah, and I mean, out of that one, right, that was like the scariest. It was the first one. They ended up, after we worked with you, it was like, oh, my bad, don't worry, you don't owe us anything. So, like, it's like, how, what, like, what? And so, yeah, it was awful. It was very stressful. And so I guess, the point of this podcast and kind of what you're doing a lot of too, I guess, is like, how do we prevent those scary situations from happening? Because you are eventually going to have a recoupment audit, right? some are on a regular basis.
It happens all the time, and it's happening to. It's beginning, it seems to me, just in sort of watching the ebb and flow of things, things got a little bit quieter during COVID days, right? There wasn't as much auditing. It still was happening, but not on as much of a scale. And really, in the past year and a half, I've seen it kick up a lot more. So I see people often dealing with 2 or 3 audits from different payers at the same time. Which is hard too, because how do you respond to that?
Yeah, for sure. And so I think maybe just, some of our listeners, viewers, maybe they don't know exactly what a recoupment audit is. So if you can, we can just kind of step back and say, okay, what is a recoupment audit? Why do they do it? Like, what does it kind of look like when you get a recoupment audit?
Sure. So there are, and maybe it's helpful to explain the couple of different kinds of audits there are, right? So there are what I call kind of compliance and administrative clinical audits, where they come in and they look at your records. They look both at your administrative records, your intake paperwork, to make sure everything is looking good there, as well as looking at your session note documentation, your treatment planning documentation, parent training, all of that, to see what's going on. And then they come back. What we usually see with particularly some of the big commercial payers, is you'll get this rubric that kind of scores you in all these different areas. And depending on the payer, you may get, a score by area. And if you're not above a certain percentage, and each one sets their own percentages, you may be required to do a performance improvement plan in that area. Or you may get an overall score, and if it's, again, not above a certain threshold, you may be required to do an overall performance improvement plan, which is, this is, the payer telling you what they found incorrect, you saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do to make it better in the future. And just in that regard, you don't want to overpromise what you're going to do. I'd rather see someone have no performance improvement plan, which is not what I would like to see ultimately, but then have a performance improvement plan that they can't live up to, because that's going to cause more problems for you if the payer comes back, and they often do 3 or 6 months later, just to check in to make sure you're doing what you said you were going to be doing, and now all of a sudden you're not doing that, right? That's just not a good look for anybody. But almost always when we see those clinical audits, they're almost always followed by a billing audit. And payers, I have heard from payers that, they're not tied to one another, but, I take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because I almost always see them follow one behind the other. It's not always necessarily for the same children, and the dates of service may be done differently. So, for example, one of the big commercial payers will do a clinical administrative audit that they may say, let's look at 6 months of documentation. Let's look at January 1, 2024 to June 30th, 2024. And then when you get your billing audit, it may be individual dates of service that spread over the same or a different time span. And it may be some of the same kids, not some of the same kids, and individual dates of service. And it could be, 10 dates of service for Susie Jones, 25 dates of service for Jimmy Smith, 2 dates of service, for Kim Mack Rosenberg. So it's all over the place. And then what they're looking for in the billing audit is really matching up your claims, what you have billed for, how many units you've billed for, which codes you've billed for, with your clinical documentation to make sure that matches. And the recoupment is if they find that, there's something, there's a date of service that you put in a claim for and you don't have a note. Or there's a date of service you put in a claim for 12 units and your note start and stop time indicates that you provided, 8 units of service. And that could be a situation when you're responding that maybe there's a missing note somewhere, right? In that unit, you have a note for 4 units somewhere else, and either they didn't see it or you didn't produce it, or maybe, we're all human. There's a chance you don't have that note, right? But so the recoupment is when they find these errors, and it may be, each payer has, as you all know, each payer has their own standards of, what they use as guidelines for what your notes need to contain. And they're looking, and they're getting more and more rigorous in what they're checking too. I've seen this. One of the things I'm seeing a lot more now is that they're looking to notes for fidelity with the treatment plan. So they're comparing, they're taking your treatment plan and saying, okay, is your BT or your RBT doing what they're supposed to be doing according to the treatment plan? And that's why it's important, and I've been recommending for some time now, but it's becoming more important because we're seeing this happening, that even though most of the payers aren't paying for that ongoing treatment planning, they're only paying for 97151 right at the reauth time period, to continue to do that ongoing and document that ongoing treatment planning. Because if you have a child who's somewhere in that 6-month period, maybe masters something, or that there's a program or goal is just, when, as you're implementing it, is too challenging for a child, needs to be scaled back. If your treatment, if you're not reflecting that in a note, that you can then, even if it's a non-billable note, that you can provide to the funder. And there's something, so let's take the master goal. So maybe you're putting in place a new goal right at 3 months that wasn't in the treatment plan before. It'll be reflected in the next treatment plan. But if it's not documented somewhere and your RBT or BT is implementing that program and it's not showing up in the treatment plan, they're going to be like, I'm sorry, what's happening here? This isn't, your RBT doesn't have the authority. It's not within the scope of their practice to implement some goal that they decided. Because I've seen situations where you do have an RBT who has good intentions, but is doing something that's absolutely not in the treatment plan, right? They decide that it would be really helpful for a child to learn this particular thing or work on this particular skill, but it's not written down anywhere, and that's not what they're supposed to be doing, right? So they're looking for that. But sometimes they're also looking for things that are not real things they should be looking for, if that makes sense. The best example I have of this is an audit a few years ago where literally, and it was over $1 million recoupment, but there were occasional line items in what you get back, and we'll talk about what they should be sending back to you in a second. But there were occasional things where, missing note or narrative was insufficient. We can debate whether that's true or not. Start and stop time is missing on a note. Okay, that's a problem. But every single one had, the main reason was a lack of ABC data in the note. It didn't matter if it was 97155, 97153, 97156. They wanted AB. And I'm like, that's not the way ABA works. We don't have ABC data every single note. But we literally had to write an appeal letter that first explained, because it seemed like they didn't understand. It was as if someone had read the phrase ABC, and they were like, that's what they have to do, right? I'm like, we're not every time. And so we literally had to explain what it was. When you take ABC data, we had literally 30 kids in this audit. 2 kids who had ABC data during the time frame of the audit period. Most of the kids, but we had to go treatment plan by treatment plan to show that, certain kids didn't have behaviors that required taking ABC data, that for those who did, the data was taken either, before or after. It was just, and again, it wasn't my client's fault. My client was doing what they were supposed to be doing. It was someone at the payer who just didn't understand the concept.
Hey, ABA business owners, struggling to navigate the complex world of ABA practice management?
You're not alone. We've been there. And that's why we created the ABA Business Leaders Membership. It's your how-to guide for everything you need to run a successful, ethical ABA practice.
From compliance to culture, from billing to hiring, we've got you covered with in-depth videos and insider advice you'll wish you had years ago.
Absolutely. But guess what? You don't have to figure it out alone. Our ABA Business Leaders Membership isn't just a guide, it's your growth accelerator featuring 34 CEUs to keep you and your team on the cutting edge.
That's right. Plus, you get exclusive access to content you can't find anywhere else. Think webinars, live Q&As, real-life success stories from practices making it happen.
And the community aspect is unbeatable. Imagine being connected to a network of ABA business owners, sharing, learning, and evolving together.
No more second-guessing your business decisions or wondering if there's a better way. With the ABA Business Leaders Membership, clarity, confidence, and continuous learning are what you're signing on for.
So, if you're all in on elevating your ABA practice, join us. It's time your business not just survived, but thrived.
Head on over to 3piesquared.com and check out the ABA Business Leaders Membership. Let's take your practice to the next level together. Right. I mean, and that kind of brings me to my first question. Is is there any, and you may not know the answer to this, but is there any other medical field where they do such rigorous audits in their system? Are they doing this to doctors? Are they doing this to therapists? Because I don't know. I don't hear, I couldn't imagine a payer going and saying, well, you didn't document that that broken arm correctly. We want our money back. I don't know. Maybe they do. Do you see that in other fields?
I think it happens sometimes in fields that are considered sort of controversial fields, whether they actually are controversial or not, right? Pain management doctors, right? They're always, pain management doctors, chiropractors, are often scrutinized. I think possibly some other mental health fields are, but ABA is definitely under a spotlight. And particularly, in the past several years, more and more, with the TRICARE reports coming out and, some of the False Claims Act cases that the Department of Justice is investigating and prosecuting, people are looking at it, and then we've all seen there has been some, not necessarily flattering press surrounding ABA.
Yeah.
And it's, really a lot of it, I think, stems from a misunderstanding of what ABA is and what good ABA looks like. And, I'm not a clinician, I'm the lawyer, but I'm deep in, in people's documentation, and I even do sometimes site visits to clients. So I see what ABA looks like, and I think, you all can attest to this way more than I can, but it's a field that has really evolved over time too. And if you saw ABA 25 or 30 years ago, it's very different than ABA today in most practices. Sure. And people don't necessarily understand that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely enough bad ABA going around, right, that that the claim can be made. So, so if someone comes to you and says, I guess okay, great, scrutinize our work, and I'm all for external audits. I love the idea that you're doing that. This only helps us, right? It can only make us better. But if someone is coming after you saying, yeah, you didn't put ABC data in every session note, or what is an acceptable recoupment versus like, okay, this is above and beyond what you can't ask for this back, right? Like, is there a line there, or does it matter what the funder requires in the note? Is that a part of it too?
It is a part of it. So I don't think there's not a hard and fast, this is an acceptable recoupment, this isn't. The ABC data one, right? It took time and effort to explain what all this was, but that was not a proper grounds to recoup. I mean, it just wasn't. But by the same vein, if you have a bunch of notes that don't have a start and stop time on them, and you have no other way to prove that the session took place for the number of units that you billed it took place, that is an issue. And there are ways to protect against that happening, right? So certainly, if you're using electronic medical record systems, you can set them up so that the start and stop time populates. I prefer not to see it populate from a timesheet or a scheduled time so that everything starts at 9 and ends at 2, right? That's because I'll tell you, funders are looking at that too, right? They're like, I'm sorry, in real life, not everything starts and stops on the hour, the half hour, the quarter hour, right? So, when do you really start and stop? And they're scrutinizing things like, especially if you're pulling in from that schedule or that timesheet, let's say the session is 9 to 2 as scheduled. Maybe it really started at 8:57 and ended at 2:06. But your RBT signed the note at 2:02. They're like, your stop time is 2:06. Why is the note signed at 2:02? Your session didn't really go to 2:06. I mean, they're digging in deep. So, as part of either, having me or someone else come in and do an internal, audit of your records, auditing yourself to make sure those things aren't happening is important too. So that, or they'll look to see for, funders who require, or sometimes providers like to have parent signatures on notes, especially when you're providing home services. Make sure the parent's not signing before the session's over too, right? They're attesting that someone was in their home providing services for a certain period of time. But those things are being looked at carefully. But if you have notes without start and stop time, you may be able, and again, it varies with the funder, it varies with the auditor, frankly, sometimes. But if I have a system where I'm using one of the major payroll companies to track the payroll for my staff, and so I'm having them clock in and clock out on an ADP or something like that, and they all have apps that you can use to do this, and I can show that someone clocked in at X time and clocked out at Y time at someone's house, and a lot of them have geo-tracking that goes along with it. So I mean, I have used geo-tracking to prove that people are where they say they are at certain times. And Medicaid is starting to put in place requiring that information, which is not necessarily a horrible thing, because I have seen cases where that geo-tracking proves that something was going sideways too. So, and home services, clinic is quote unquote easy, right? You have, a person's in the clinic or they're not. Mostly you would hear from parents if someone's not showing up on time or is constantly 10 or 15 minutes late or whatever. Most parents are going to call you and not be happy with that to begin with. But, so I guess what they're looking for in the recoupment and what you end up fighting over is, sometimes is the narrative adequate to support the session? And that's like a whole spectrum of information in and of itself, right? They're looking to see that notes aren't cloned notes. So I think people differ on this, but I'm not a huge fan of sentence starters for narratives because it starts to look like a clone note and you get drift away from sort of unique narrative if people have sentence starters. I think examples are good and training is good, and I like to do training where you provide, excuse me, you provide, on the screen or on the PowerPoint, however you're doing it on the Zoom, you show people a narrative, and you're like, so good narrative, bad narrative, and why? Let's talk about it. But I've seen companies where their notes all start like, Kim had a better day today than yesterday. Or Kim had a worse day today than yesterday. Kim had a day that was about the same as yesterday. Every note starts that way. Every one of them. And that begins to look a little bit like a clone note. And as you drift away from, again, doing that independent, unique note every day, that becomes an issue. But, there are some notes I can look at, and you've got an 8-hour, 6-hour session, and you have 2 sentences for narrative. I have an issue with that. And I would tell a provider client, we need to beef up these narratives. On the other hand, I've seen notes where literally I had a client who had every half hour required their BTs to write several sentences. And I had a funder try to tell me that wasn't adequate. And I'm like, they're describing the highlights of literally every half hour. I'm like, if that's not adequate, I've not seen an adequate note in my life. So you don't want to be fighting. Fighting at the margins is hard, and but sometimes there is. You've got a very full note, and that's ridiculous to claim that it didn't talk about every single program you ran. Well, now a lot of times you're pulling data into the notes anyway, so you can see what was done, particularly with the behavior programs. But and I'll look to data. If the notes aren't great and I'm getting someone ready for an audit, I'll look at data. And certainly as part of my internal auditing process, I look at people's data to help them assess whether their technicians are doing what they should be doing. I get a little concerned if every day I see there's no data taken for the first 20 minutes and last 20 minutes of a session. I get concerned if there's huge gaps in the data within a session. Now there could be reasons for that, right? So you don't just say, well, you've got a problem here. Sometimes you have an internet connectivity problem. Sometimes you have a child who is engaging in a self-injurious behavior, and obviously your first focus has to be on the individual's safety, not making sure you're clicking a button to take your data, right? So there are reasons, but then if there is something like a behavior, you better be documenting that in your note because then that's where you see the connection between the note and the data, right? So and I'm starting to see funders asking to see data as part of their auditing process. That didn't used to happen a lot.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. And that was one of the things that always kind of blew my mind when we were going through this was, the data is like the meat of what we're doing, right? And the narrative, I can understand the importance of it. But at the same time, like the narrative was seemed to be a separate thing, right? Especially before we learned more and more about how to form a narrative, because we were so focused on data collection, and that's what we looked at. We don't we didn't typically just write a narrative about the session, like a session summary, just for the fun of it. Especially when we were private pay before we ever even dealt with insurances. Right. We looked at the data, and we would interpret the data for the parents, and interpret the data for our staff, and use the data to determine our next steps. Right. And so I think that whole point of starting to write session notes, and then back in the day I was doing soap notes and burp notes and all the things, and those probably did look more like clone notes back in the day because we just followed a very simple template, and you would use those same phrases for and so, but now it's really gotten so complicated, and we really stress about how important it is to train your staff to write notes, because you don't want clone notes, and you want them to put the right things in the notes. Right. And there are things that you don't want them to put in the notes, like you were saying earlier, don't talk to, not just don't talk about something you shouldn't do, but you shouldn't be doing what you shouldn't be doing. But still, you could just naively put something in there about like client's brother came in and we did a turn taking game because you're really excited that the client did this turn taking thing and whatever, right? But then like that could cause a flag because there's nothing in the treatment plan about turn taking. So it really starts to get where then there's like this panic around it. Like, what do I do? How do I train my staff of what to put in and what not to put in notes? And I like your idea of like a good note versus a bad note, and why is it a bad note? More so than just offering visuals and prompts for the staff just to fill in the blank. But I don't know. It's that's one thing that just I think is more, maybe even more abstract. Because yeah, do you like narrate every single thing? We had some texts that like their notes are way too long and they no too much. And then like you said, we had some that had like a sentence, like great day, or not even a sentence. And we're like, no, that's like, so I don't know I love what you're saying, but are there any other pieces of advice to not feel so overwhelmed with that part?
For sure. And I'm thinking back to the days, I'm sure you remember these, and it's in part because y'all, you go to school and no one teaches you to write a SOAP note. Like, that's not right. It still no one teaches, grad students how to write a SOAP note, right? And it's become an important piece of what you have to do, let alone your behavior technicians who sometimes are just they're high school graduates. Maybe they're in college, maybe they're a college graduate, but there are a lot, there's a range of educational background for technicians too. And certainly, at all levels of variability in writing skills, which is not necessarily reflective of, how intelligent a person is or anything. Some people are better writers than others. But, I think back to the days, like the early days where like the treatment note would be, yes, had a great day, smiley face. I'm like, yeah, I still every once in a while see a smiley face in someone's notes, and I'm like, nope, that's not a SOAP note thing. But what I always go back to with the narrative is, for me, the touch point of it is, what does that have to do with the provision of ABA services? So I'll see notes that will say things like, I got to Jimmy's house today and it had snowed last night and we went out in the yard and we made snow angels. I'm like, it's great. What were you working on? Were you working on, two-step directions? Were you working on I could think of a whole bunch of things you would be working on, so many programs that you would be running, but you're not telling me that. You're telling me you had fun playing in the snow, right? Or, we were in the play yard and, Jimmy pulled Susie in the wagon and then Susie pulled Jimmy in the wagon, right? Like, that goes back to, were you working on turn taking? Then that's what you're talking about, right? Is that a program that you are working on? I never want to see, unless it's very clear what was happening and that the time is well documented. Every once in a while I see a note that mentions that a child took a nap. And I've had people say to me, well, he wasn't really napping, he was fake napping as an avoidant thing. I'm like, well, that's not what it says. It doesn't say he was engaging in an avoidant behavior. It says he was sleeping. There's a big difference between pretending to be asleep to avoid doing your work versus actually being asleep. So things like that need to be, I had a client where I really had to, in a big audit, there was one note that mentioned napping. And the way their note, and this goes back several years, and the way their notes were that they had like a cover sheet that documented all the different codes that they were billing that day and the times and the number of units. And it took me a while to sit down with that information and with the session notes and figure out that even though the client napped from, say, 1 to 2, there was no billing for that nap time, because what was showing to the funder when they're auditing was a number of units that looked like it included nap time, but the problem was it included 97155 time too. So when you backed all that out and unwound it, there was no billing for a child sleeping, but it didn't look that way from the start. So being really careful about documenting things like that. Or if a child, has, and some of these kids are little, they do nap while they're in a clinic, and you have to be careful about that. Or if you have kids who are eating a meal or a snack and you're not working on anything during that meal time. I mean, oftentimes you are, but if you are, like, those times are, things that the funders are particularly, and I think, in many respects justifiably so, right? They don't want to pay you just for sitting and having lunch with a child. But if you're working on programs that are in your treatment plan during that lunchtime, again, just be mindful that you're really documenting that you're taking data, that, you can prove that you were continuing services during what to someone might look like, a period where you're just having lunch. And, it depends on who your auditor is, right? So sometimes we see auditors who are BCBAs, right? They theoretically understand the practice. But sometimes it's an RN or someone with a coding certification. And it's not that, they're not smart people who don't know how to do their jobs, but if they're not familiar with ABA, they particularly may be thrown by something, that mentions providing services during lunch. Because, you go to the dermatologist, they're not sitting and having lunch with you and checking out, looking at your skin. That doesn't happen in a traditional medical practice. So and I think, the audit I described where they wanted ABC data in every note. I'm like, well, clearly you are not a BCBA if you think that's what you need. So sometimes, and I really had to go to the mat and had to escalate in a very nice way, because the lady who did it was very nice, but an auditor who was, I think she was an RN and had a coding certification, audited one of my clients, and for 97155 time, wanted all that time billed on the day that they finalized the treatment plan. So it didn't matter if you did, 2 hours a day for 4 days, right? You did your assessments, you did your, all the things. They wanted it all billed on one day. And I was like, you can't do that. I was very nicely trying to say, that's actually kind of fraudulent billing because you didn't provide all those services on that day. And I said, also imagine, like, say you have 8 hours of treatment planning per child, and you're working on 2 children's reauths. You finish those both on Friday, whatever, 16 hours of time, plus you did some 97155 time for a couple of kids, and you did some parent training. Suddenly you've worked 27 hours on Friday, when in reality you haven't. I'm like, you are actually, let's look at, medically unlikely edits there, but also there are only so many hours in a day. You're actually potentially setting up, I can very easily see you setting up a situation where it creates a false red flag for everybody. Like, it doesn't benefit anybody to do it that way. But this woman kept saying, this is how it has to be done. If we do an occupational therapy assessment, it's, one day. I'm like, well, it's a totally different field. You can't, it's apples and oranges. You can't compare the two. I go in, I've, injured my knee, and I go in for OT, or, even if I'm having OT to treat autism, you go in and it's a relatively quick assessment that's done, and it's probably done in one day. Very different. So it's, again, you need to kind of know your audience and know who you're responding to. And oftentimes that becomes evident just even looking at the audit results that you get.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I've got a couple of big questions here, but can you share a little bit more about what a clone note actually is? I know copying and pasting the same note 15 times, obviously, but I'm sure there's some nuance to that. And like you said, if every note starts off the same way, we're kind of going down this slippery slope. And then also, how do you feel about checklists in a session note? Should we be using those, or should we stay away from those? Or
So on the clone note issue, it is a slippery slope, right? Just because the first sentence of every note is the same doesn't mean it's a clone note. But we've all, I'm sure, seen enough situations where you have a technician who either gets behind in note writing or whatever, and copies and pastes from one day to the next, or copies and pastes from one kid to the next kid. And if all those programs are looking the same and it looks like the same thing is happening every day, and, the child has, and Jimmy was in a good mood, and, Jimmy didn't sleep well the night before, and, we worked on A, B, C, D, and E, and it's the same every day, that looks suspicious. And sometimes you don't, even if you're doing internal monitoring and auditing, unless you sit down and really put like a week's worth of notes in front of you. If you're monitoring 10% of notes and you're getting notes here and there, you may not see a pattern. But when you sit down and look at, a nice straight run of notes, you may see it. And there are things that you can put in place in your EMR systems to prevent copying and pasting notes. Now that doesn't, there are ways people could work around it too, but you can at least put some guardrails in place. And I think, there are ways to start to use AI to catch some of those cloned notes too, right? Because AI can do some comparisons for you. It's not to say use AI to write your notes. That's a different issue, and it's becoming a hot topic in the industry, right? But to use AI to try to catch some of those discrepancies. And sometimes your practice management systems have things built in too that you can use to catch problems, not necessarily a cloned note, but I've seen some of the EMR systems catch things like, because they're monitoring times that people are doing their work too, a BCBA who was in a 97155 session working on a treatment plan for a different child at the same time. I'm like, well, then you're not providing face-to-face services, right? So, you catch that problem, you remediate, you work with the staff to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But you've got this safeguard built in, and that is an example that I actually saw in real life. And the system caught it. They're like, wait a minute, this person's billing 97151 and 97155 at the same time for two different clients, right? So, and again, there are lots of people, the vast majority of people providing services are doing a great job, and they're doing their best, and they're we all make mistakes because we're all human, right? But they're unintentional. But then you catch someone doing something like, there aren't really circumstances where I can think of a good reason you should be working on someone else's treatment plan when you're supposed to be providing a face-to-face service. Like, that's someone trying to catch up, right? So, so clone notes are, you want to watch for them. You want to, set up systems so that you can try to catch them. And, it's, instead of sentence starters, you can use some things like, some prompts maybe might be better, right? Describe how the client, seemed as they came in this morning, or describe the programs you worked on. What was the most important program, or the program that took the longest that you worked on today? What were the results? Were there anything you want the BCBA to know about this? Did the client really struggle with it? Did the client, was it, a new task? Maybe you're introducing something new. How did they do? Did we see some behaviors as a result because it's something they don't, it's a non-preferred task and they don't want to do it. So using prompts, and some of the systems let you have drop-down prompts that you can use to do that. That's less likely to lead to something that looks like a clone note, but it provides a way to help your technicians in particular to write a good note. And April, you're absolutely right that there's like this balance between the person who wants to write War and Peace every day and the person who's like, Yep, great session, smiley face, we're done. There's a lot of real estate in between that, and training people how to do it and how to do it, especially because, the 9 codes are very clear that writing your note is a non-billable event that shouldn't be taking place during the session. And for me, and I will say this, there are people who differ in their thoughts on this. I like to use the word touchstone a lot. So my touchstone on this is, is what you're doing interfering with the provision of face-to-face services? So if you're sitting there writing a whole paragraph in the middle of a session, that's probably interfering with the provision of services. But if you're writing 2 words to remember, tantrum 20 minutes, to remind yourself, 6 hours later when the session is over that happened, or if a child's using a reinforcer and you very quickly jot down a couple of bullet points, to me, those sort of reminders are akin to taking data, right? Because you're taking data, and it doesn't interfere with the provision of face-to-face services. So make sure that happens. And then when you sit down after your session, to finish the note and then sign the note at a time that is after the end time of your session, you've got just very simple prompts that remind you of what happened during the session versus writing a note during a session. And, there are people who will say, well, you can use the last 7 minutes of every session to write your note. You really shouldn't be using those sessions are, again, it's for the provision of face-to-face services. If you have a program that naturally, you're working on a program and it ends 2 minutes before the session is over, the child's probably going to use a reinforcer those last couple minutes, right? If they've done well with, and then you maybe can start working on something. But those you're not supposed to use the rounding rules to be able to create an opportunity to write your note at the end of every, to finish, to literally draft your whole note during the session time. That will be caught pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, those are go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I know that your specialty is not employment law, but I just wanted to touch on just one little thing. So, okay, so you're training your staff, of how to do little jot down notes as they're taking data that does not interfere with their face-to-face session and interaction with the child. And then they have to write their session note after they've finished billing for this client session. Do you still have to pay them for the time, for the 7, 10, 15 minutes it takes them to write that note after they're no longer billing?
Yes, so I'm not an employment lawyer, but I am hard pressed to think of any state that would allow you to not pay someone while they're still working, right? Because they are still working. And I think, once the 9 codes and the supplemental guidance from the coding committee, came out on those codes, making it very clear that it was a non-billable service, for a lot of providers, that required sort of a little bit of a switch up in how they were, their billing model, their business model, because that's really more of a business issue, right? It's an issue of, okay, I can't bill for that time, but this person they're working. So, yes, they have to be paid. So maybe, and you want them to be efficient, right? You don't want someone who takes a half hour to write a note after every session. That's excessive. But you want them to be able to do their job well. And I think, there's been so much pushback I've seen sort of industry-wide. How am I going to get these people to write good notes? They can't write these notes. It's taking them too long to write the notes. That it takes so much to train them to write the notes. The notes still aren't good. We retrain. It's a process, right? No one wakes up knowing how to write a SOAP note. You aren't taught it in high school. You aren't taught it in college. You aren't taught it in your graduate program. But over time, you also become more adept at writing those notes, right? So the person who took 10 minutes to write a note initially, or 15, after a little while, they're doing it in 5 minutes. So it becomes less time too.
Right. I agree with that, especially if you're supporting your staff in the way that you should be supporting your staff. But that kind of brings us back to Stephen's question earlier about checklists. I think that's why checklists are so tempting. To like have like checklists within like programs completed or like
Yeah, I know we had a recoupment audit at one point, and they were like, "Yeah, I don't like these checklists." Right? Now they didn't recoup any money from us, but their feedback was, "We don't like checklists.
And
You
it
need to get rid
wasn't
of them."
just a checklist. We also had a narrative
we
as
still had
well.
a
But it was
narrative,
like a
right,
place
yes.
for us to
Yeah.
like check what programs got completed. And, maybe a kid's got 15 programs, but it was only a 2-hour session that day versus a 6-hour session.
Like, were there any parent concerns? Yes or no? Right? Just like
Yeah.
general things
Yeah.
that you would want to make sure that we cover during the session. They didn't appear. They didn't like that. So.
I mean, I think it depends on, what the checklist is for, whether there's any narrative to go along with the checklist. It's not necessarily, I don't think, in my personal opinion, and I haven't gotten a lot of pushback on checklists from funders, but obviously you have, at least from this one funder. But I think you could say, were there any parent concerns? Yes or no. If you check no, it's no. But if you check yes, like you have a drop down for an explanation of what it was. Yes, mom reported, on Monday morning that Kim hadn't slept well all weekend, so, she may be off her game today because she's tired and irritable. Or, parents are getting divorced or grandma passed away. All kinds of things happen, right, that may impact what goes on during a session. And it's important for everyone to know that, right? Because if you see, like Monday session is a complete train wreck, right? I mean, the child is just tantruming and cannot focus and is not, will not attend to tasks. What the heck happened on Monday? If you don't have an opportunity to record that sort of subject, that information that says, yeah, she didn't sleep all weekend. So what a surprise that, when demands are placed on her, it's very challenging. And I think I've used checklists for things like, what different types of ABA, and I may not be using the right terminology, and I apologize, but what types of ABA methodologies are you using, right? Are you using NET? Are you using DTT? Are you using the pre-Mack principle? What are you doing during a session, right? You can check off for, the 3 things you do. And I have my clients tailor those checklists usually to, not everyone uses everything, right? I could list 25 things, but you may use 5 of them in your practice as a general rule, right? You don't need a checklist of 25 things. And you have to make sure too that if you're using checklists, that your texts particularly understand the different things. So if you're recording client affect and you're going to say, they had, a flat affect, that they understand what a flat affect is so that they're accurately reporting that. I think with the programs run, the specific programs, it's much easier now with a lot of the EMR systems to just pull that information into the note through the system. And I think that a lot of funders do like that and they want to see it. A lot of the blues, for example, have very specific guidance that you have to have data points in your notes. So they're wanting to see that information pulled in.
Gotcha. And I know you said a note shouldn't take 30 minutes, and hopefully over time, your techs, even BCBAs, they'll get better and maybe it'll take 5 minutes. But is there just from, maybe you don't have, probably don't have data on this.
I haven't taken data on it.
But do you have this feels right, 6-7 minutes is probably what we should be shooting for here, or is it less than that, or
I mean, part of it depends on the length of a session, right? You're
Sure.
going to need to write a lot more if you were with a child all day or most of a day versus a 2-hour.
Sure.
Yeah.
session, right? You can probably do a 2-hour session literally in a couple of minutes, versus, let's explain what went on for 6 hours with this child.
Right, and I think that's going to differ. Just like she was saying, that a newer staff member might take longer in the beginning, and then you want to see that time kind of at least come down a little bit and get to a nice, comfortable
Right.
place. And then of course, I know with us, there were certain staffs that needed some special accommodations for writing their session notes, and so that was something that we had to take into consideration too.
Yeah, I guess especially on the tech side of things, right? There's just so much pressure, right? Especially in home, right? They're probably going to be late to their second session just because of traffic and the way the sessions are booked anyways. And now we're saying, well, you can't really bill for these, right? And don't use the roundup rule, and so there is this pressure, especially on the techs, where they're like, yeah, this cloning stuff looks real good to me, right? And nobody's looking, and it doesn't really matter. And so unintending, right? I don't feel like anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to commit fraud today, right?
Yep. Nope. Agreed. Yep.
And so it's there's just so many pressures on these wonderful people doing such hard work, that there's just too much incentive to do that, right? And enough companies are looking the other ways, and this is kind of probably why we're where we are, right? And we are scrutinized so much. So, the other question I had was, okay, you got a bad note, right? It's got a smiley face and it is one said, can we go back and edit this? Can we recall what took place and let's figure out what happened? Go back and edit this note. Is that a good idea?
No, generally not. So amending notes is tricky, in part because, you have to look at what you're amending, why you're amending it, and when you're amending it. So it's one thing, and particularly with the EMR systems, I am a fan of a separate amendment of a note. It's a separate document that you create that says I'm amending my note from my session yesterday from 12 to 2, and here's my amendment and why. And you sign and date that contemporaneously, right? Now, it's one thing to amend something. Maybe I wrote my note yesterday and I was, like you said, rushing to get to my next session, whatever. And I forgot to put something in about how long the client engaged in a self-injurious behavior, right? And it was a significant amount of time. And I maybe just said, was engaging in whatever the behavior was. And I wake up the next morning and I go, oh, I forgot to put in the note, just so we have some sense, because there's going to be a gap in the data and all of this. I go in the next day and I say to someone, I need to amend my note. I just want to say that the child was engaging in this behavior for 20 minutes. Fine, it's the next day. It's, reasonable and credible to think that I would remember the next day. If I come to you 2 months later and say, hey, I just remembered on April 5th that, Tim, I know I put in the note that he engaged in self-injurious behavior, but I forgot to tell you it was 20 minutes. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't remember what I had for breakfast last Tuesday, let alone, a particular child, a particular session 2 months ago. So it becomes kind of incredible. Start and stop time, unless you have, some secondary source that you can back it up with. Again, those time records, maybe you have it. It becomes very, very hard. If you forgot to sign a note, I always recommend, as I'm sure you guys do as well, that you set up your EMR system so a note doesn't release and doesn't convert unless you've signed it. I'm a big believer in, in making sure your notes are completed with all the required elements that you set up. And in a lot of systems, I think some are better than others at this, but you can set up those guardrails that, your note doesn't release if there's not a time in, time out. Your note doesn't release, if it's not signed. But some of the systems are set up in ways, and I've dealt with this in more than one audit, so I know it's an issue. One of the biggest EMR systems allows you to sign their signature spots both for the note and on the timesheet. And you wouldn't logically necessarily think that you have to sign twice with a note. And if you only sign the time card, when you print out that note, it looks like you have a signed document, right? You have it's releasing, and you go to print out the note for the audit, and you send it in, and you've got a bunch of unsigned notes, but they're not really unsigned. They're not they look unsigned, but you have a date and time stamped signature in that EMR system. Thus far, with that explanation and knowing that you have those signed notes, you have corroborating evidence. And I've argued, that they should take that, and I've had payers accept that and say, I'm like, look, the system is just screwy. We're working with them. I don't know why it happened. I don't know why that's the way it is set up, but it's just, a default setting that, again, I think should be changed, but I don't run the world, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you ask. I don't want to run the world, but it's one of those quirks that just happens. And I think that's a way also that it's important that people understand that everything that your EMR system has in place may be necessary but not sufficient for compliance. I think there's a lot of incentive among, not incentive, but there's a lot of desire among providers to just say, well, this system, I'm relying on my EMR system to provide everything I need to be in compliance with all my payers. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times you have to go in and you have to be like, I remember when a lot of the state Medicaids in particular started to ask for, and now almost everyone requires it, a footer or header on the page that has the individual's name and some identifying number, whether it's your clinic ID number, their insurance number, just, some date of birth, but some identifying information. And it just wasn't set up to print out on all these systems that way. And I went to some of the bigger, I talked to these folks a fair amount and went to them and said, you need to just do this. Just do this as a default. And, I think for liability reasons, they also don't want to purport to provide everything that every payer needs. It's, it's an onerous burden if you're a nationwide system that people are relying on to know what every funder in every state requires. But there are some things that you couldn't do it. I mean, it's like it's a Sisyphean task. You're pushing a boulder up a hill. But some of those big ones that you begin to see as industry trends, I'd like to see them incorporated more quickly into the electronic medical record systems, because people do, I've seen people get, audit findings where it's something that to me seems so obvious that their system should provide and they don't. Like this footer, right? I'm like, why can't we just print the footer out? And this weird signature thing, I mean, I've had it happen to a few clients now where they're like, the tech, not intending to do anything wrong, they sign where they think they need to sign, and they've signed once. You would think, signing once would be okay. And, it's not like buying a house. You don't have to sign 50 times. But then you print it out and you have a note without a signature. And they're like, hey, where's the signature? So I think, people need to be aware of, both the benefits and the limitations of those systems. But you can, there's a lot that you can fight on audits too. So sometimes you can show that, again, the time card thing, you can show that time card is actually there. You can fight about whether or not something is sufficient. You can fight about, maybe you use the wrong modifier in your billing. That happens a lot these days with the HM and HN modifiers. People get them mixed up, or they bill the wrong one on accident. They're not intending to commit fraud. Let's figure out how we can unwind this. And if you've got a rate difference, like the services were rendered. You know who we have everything. We're not trying to hide who provided the service. We made a mistake in the use of a modifier. I mean, I saw that all the time during like the height of COVID, where everyone was doing telehealth, and everyone had like different modifiers they were using for telehealth, and it was just all over the place. And then they were coming back and auditing and saying, well, you used the wrong. I'm like, well, I'm looking at your guidelines, and they're not clear at all what you would like from someone. And really, if what you're doing as a funder, as a payer, is using this billing audit to determine if services were rendered as billed, then the fact that I accidentally used the wrong modifier shouldn't be the death knell of my entire claim, right? If there's a rate difference, maybe it's recouping the delta because you paid at a rate that was a higher rate than I even intended that you pay me. But, not, and your funder should be providing you in audit results. And a couple times, really, even in the last week, literally, I'm talking to people who have not gotten this information. You should be getting a claim by claim spreadsheet that accompanies, if they're sending a finding letter, those finding letters are usually, they're identifying the big items, right? They're saying, you had 97153, you have, 62 notes that aren't signed, and you have, notes, 5 notes with insufficient narrative, and you have 15 notes with the wrong modifier. But they don't tell you which 50, right? They've looked at a bunch of claims. They don't tell you which ones. So they should be providing that spreadsheet that then provides that breakout detail of like the primary reason for denial, and if there are any secondary, tertiary reasons for denial as well. And that way you can say, okay, here are the 62 claims that aren't signed or whatever it is. And you can address that, and you can say, oh, I went back into my EMR system and that was, a problem with the EMR system. Here are the printed out time-stamped, date-stamped signatures for those dates of service. But if you don't have that information, you can't adequately address it. And like I said, I've had a couple people within the past week who have come back to me, and literally one has a payer who's refusing to give that information.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is like, what would you do if you didn't get that information that you needed? Like, is that when you reach out to you or an attorney?
Yeah, sometimes I step in, and sometimes I hate to say it. Sometimes that's what it takes to get some action, right? It takes me stepping in or me making a phone call, and all of a sudden, things start to happen.
Well, that's one of the biggest takeaways that I personally learned from working with you and Jody back in the day was that you said, stop. Like, basically, you're like, pause, just take a breath. Like, they look through this, really look at what, and you taught us like what to look for and how to like interpret some of these things. And then the whole point of like, okay, were you trying, like, was this like they're trying to catch you and like committing fraud, but obviously you still had these sessions because you have these pieces over here. You were missing things. They weren't the greatest. Let's work on getting these systems better. But let's explain to them that like you were at this session and this is how you're going to improve your things next time. Or even like, okay, no, you don't have to send X piece of paperwork or data. They have no need for that. Or, and even knowing how far that they're allowed to go back. So there's a lot of things like when you get this like letter in the mail or email or however they send them now, that it doesn't mean like, okay, because we go into full panic mode, especially if we see those big dollar signs. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean you got to go cash out your 401k or whatever, dig into debt to like give them a check real quick. Like stop and sit and analyze and really look at what's going on. And if you don't know, reach out to you
Yeah.
or someone like you that knows.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm always telling people to contact you, but like, I like anybody says, oh, they've got an audit. I'm like, don't send anything to them, nothing. Just talk to Kim, and then you put a plan in place. Because like again, I really want this to be like an educating experience where if I'm doing something wrong, I wanna correct it. Like I have no intention of doing something that you want. Like I'm not here to like commit fraud, or I'm not here to like not provide what you're asking for. I want to do the right thing.
Just tell me what that
just
is.
Tell me what that is. Like don't make this a mystery, right? Like and a lot of our audits were like that. It's like they would tell us how terrible and awful we were and how much money they wanted back, and then they would never tell us what we did that was so terrible and awful, right? And it's just you can't do that. That's not fair, right? That's not about improving systems. It's about you getting your money, right? Like, and it's frustrating.
It's very frustrating, and like you said, this should be about, and I understand to a certain degree from their perspective, and I think this is one of the reasons ABA does get audited a lot, right? It can be a very expensive service that's provided over a long period of time, right? It's not like going to the dermatologist once a year, twice a year, whatever people may do. And maybe you want to audit those people too, but like, you know, if you're looking at the pain management doctor who's regularly prescribing heavy narcotic pain medications, right? You're looking to see, you know, how often are they prescribing to the same person, and how much are they prescribing, and does this seem to be just a pill mill kind of thing? ABA, you know, a lot of kids get it, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 hours a week, right? And if, you know, and it's from the insurance company's perspective, they're paying a lot of money for this service. They want to make sure the service is being provided. But again, to use like my favorite word today, touchstone. The touchstone should be whether those services are being provided. You know, could the note be better? Yeah, but let's educate. Let's educate on that. Most providers that I work with, I don't know that I've ever, you know, maybe one provider who comes back from an audit and says, well, I don't want to do that. I mean, they may be like, this is, you know, this looks burdensome, this, whatever. I like literally, I think I have one person who said to me, I'm not doing that. And I'm like, well, do you want to get paid? I said, we can fight, you know, and we're doing work, you know, in the CASP's documentation special interest group, for example, in trying to come up with documentation standards that hopefully providers and payers can, you know, and it's you know, it's not a short-term thing. It takes a long time to work on that. To find things that, you know, aren't overly burdensome on providers, but give payers the comfort they need, for lack of a better word, that services are being billed as rendered. Because that's what they should really care about, right? They want to make sure that their money is going toward paying for services that actually were provided. And then let's educate on, and you know, it's not all black and white. There's a lot of gray. You know, how do we make sure that note demonstrates that services were provided, right? Because if you have a 6-hour session and you have one sentence and you don't have a ton of data, because maybe you were doing NET, or maybe the child was having behaviors, or there can be a whole, you know, series of things that may result in less data than would be ideal. But I go, you know, and you said this earlier, you know, how much do you send in? You know, what are they asking for and how much do you send in, right? You send in what they ask for, but if, you know, one of the things I do, and that I, you know, work with people to help them be able to do this on their own too, is, you know, let's look at what you have. You know, so they ask for these things. They ask for treatment plans and session notes and this and that. What's missing from there that would help them arguably have findings in your favor? So, for example, if you have, you know, it looks like you have almost no parent training, right? Like parent training just doesn't seem to be happening. whether it's for one child, whether it's across the board. What's the reason for that? Because, again, we can talk about MAPIA and all those things, but they require usually a certain amount of parent training, and they've approved parent training hours, and it's just not happening. I like parent training logs as well as the notes when sessions actually occur so that you can document, it's because, the parents canceled at the last minute every time, or they leave the session halfway through. They're like, oh, we've got to go. We have plans, whatever. And they're just not engaged, that it's not your fault that parent training isn't occurring, right? So, because when they come back and say you're not doing parent training and you just say to them, oh, it's because mom always cancels. Well, you have no proof. But if you keep a log, then you can say mom always cancels. And maybe you don't even provide that log on the first go around. It's sort of you have to assess case by case. But if you have a payer who you may get a right to appeal with, and then say, okay, they may come back and say the parent training's inadequate if it's a borderline case. You maybe say, okay, then you provide that, the next round when you appeal those results. And there'll be information when you get those audit results about how you appeal. And, you want to make sure that you timely appeal, and that if you have to supplement, you supplement the record. One of the things, I just had a call yesterday and this morning with 2 different providers where I talked about, making sure when you're sending in documentation to respond to an audit request that you keep, doesn't have to be physical because most people don't keep paper anymore, but a digital copy of everything exactly as you sent it, right? It's so important because we find so often, and I've had people say to me, I'll say, do you have a copy of what you sent? And they'll say, yeah, it's in all the kids' medical records. I'm like, well, but what did you actually send them? Because it's a couple things happen. Sometimes a note doesn't get included for whatever reason, right? You just don't send it. It's a mistake. You just didn't include it. But a lot of times I see on the payer end, depending on how they process things go missing. And again, it's not because they're intentionally taking your records and whatever, but I've had people describe to me rooms with conference room tables where there are stacks of audit files. And people come in and they take a file and they go. Or if you're sending it to a central PO box at a big payer, at an Optum, at a Blue, and I'm not picking on either of those companies, but they're just big. It goes to a central PO box, and then it's someone's job to scan those files in. And again, we're human. Mistakes get made. And even with email, this wasn't an audit, this was a medical necessity appeal, but I sent something to, it was Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, and I attached the letter and exhibits A through F, right? And the woman who I'm working with on this appeal is an expedited appeal, lovely lady. She calls me and she's like, thank you so much. I got your appeal, and I have exhibits A, C, D, and F. And I'm like, well, where are B and E? Because they were attached to the same email. Where did those go missing? So you never know. And I had another auditor who I worked with all the time at one of the big Blues, who I was actually very friendly with because I had so many audits with her. And we got along. It doesn't have to be, people screaming at each other all the time either. Sometimes, they're doing a job, and some people are nicer than other people, but a lot of people are, decent human beings. I had to upload a bunch of files to an FTP for her because these were such huge files, and they didn't typically use FTPs. She had to get special permission to get one set up, but I just couldn't email the documents to her. They were too voluminous to fax. It was COVID, and so, where are they going to go if you mail them? So we worked on this FTP thing. I uploaded the files, and she wrote back and said, okay, I got the 25 files you sent. And I said, I sent 28 files. And She, on her end, was able to. I couldn't on my end because once they were gone, they were gone. It taught me a lesson, which I'll share in a second. But she had screenshots of, or she could take screenshots of which files hit her end of the FTP. And so I could compare that to what I had sent, which I had digitally, to say, okay, I'm missing these 3 files and resend them. But now when I upload to an FTP, I take a screenshot before I hit send. So I know what I've uploaded and I have that. But, to keep that digital file, because you'll get those audit results back and they'll say, missing documentation. And in some cases, maybe you don't have a note. It is what it is. But sometimes you've sent that note to them. And you're like, well, I sent the note and here's the packet of stuff I sent and it was there. And usually they're willing to reconsider it. They will not, I have not met any funder who, if you keep going back and saying, oh yeah, I forgot to send you this and I forgot to send you this, and you're going back to them 10 times, they're like, then they become suspicious that, there's something going on there. But, if there's some initial miscommunication or something gets misdirected, and then, you get your audit results, you look at whether those are correct, you hopefully reduce your recoupment amount. But if there is still a recoupment, in many cases, you can also negotiate with the funders to reduce that amount. So it is possible in many instances, even if there is a recoupment, that you can reduce it to something that is either a lower amount, a longer payout period, or both, to make it a little less burdensome to pay some of those things back.
That's good to know. Well, I definitely want to be respectful of your time, and I just am so thankful that you're able to come on today. I know one of the biggest things that I learned from you over the years was to just keep documentation for everything. So we put a lot of policies and procedures in place of keeping documentation as you're updating treatment plans, the parent logs you were talking about. There were numerous things that and like you said, we didn't necessarily offer them up first, first request of information, but we had them. Even if parents came to us and maybe a custody or a kind of hearing where one parent wanted ABA and the other didn't, and stuff kind of got complicated, right? Or you're providing in 2 different homes, or anyways, there's so many reasons why, beyond just our programming data and the treatment plan itself, just making sure that we have systems in place to just keep track of these ongoing things, so that we have something to look back to know. And even when you're emailing and calling people, you're even if you can't get a paper trail, pull up a notes on your computer and keep track of who you talked to, what day, what you said. You always said those things matter.
They do, and doing it timely matters, right? If you made a phone call, sometimes you can't get, sometimes you get people who will not give out an email address or something like that. So you make a note that day, and it's, date and time stamped. You can see when the document's created. And people should also know, there are audit trails in their electronic medical record systems too. So I think, and so if you go in and you change a note, there's a record that someone changed.
They're going to see it. Yeah.
It's possible to be, if there's a full-on fraud investigation, it is possible that they could see that information. So people need to be mindful. And again, it doesn't mean you're committing fraud. You may think, we're still teaching people how to amend records, right? Because, sometimes they think, well, I'm just changing this thing, and it's not something consequential, but it's a medical record that you're changing. So you just need to be mindful of that. And there are ways to, like I said, there are ways to do those separate amendments, I think, in every EMR system, or you do it on paper if you're still with paper and pen.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are three services that I highly recommend to everybody who's starting an ABA business, and that's one, get an accountant. Don't mess with it, and two, get an employment attorney. And if you have a recoupment audit, talk to Kim. Like those are just it. That's like those are the basics you have to do.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And like the last question I'll ask, and then we can kind of end it because I know we've gone over, and we could talk for hours on this subject. But like, is there like a bare minimums, right? While we're not going for bare minimum, but is there a bare minimum to kind of avoid fraud claims in a session note? Like, are there just things that you just have to have to avoid those issues?
So it's not so much to avoid fraud. Fraud requires intent. And fraud is a scary word, right? People throw around the word fraud all the time. And the fraud, everyone has a fraud, waste, and abuse division of, that's what they're looking for, fraud, waste, and abuse. FWA is a term. I see that acronym all the time. You need to know what your payer standards are, right? So you need to keep track of them because they change over time. So literally, I recommend to people that they have someone whose job it is to regularly check their payer standards, but also to create even a simple Excel spreadsheet of, I work with Optum and Anthem and whatever my state, Medicaid MCOs are, and I work with TRICARE. And then these are their standards for documenting start and stop time, narrative. I know TRICARE notes require something, I'm going to get not the correct term of art, but basically client readiness at the start of the session has to be documented in a certain way for TRICARE. And then you see who has the most rigorous standards, and you want to work to those. And sometimes you may have to have a separate note for someone who has something that's just really very different than your other funders. But usually you can have a fairly standardized process, which makes life easier for everyone and makes sure compliance easier. And you want to make sure that they're meeting, your notes are meeting those standards. So you want to have internal monitoring. You want to do occasional internal audits to see where you are. But that regular monitoring is really important too, because then you'll catch where there are problems and you'll be able to remedy them, and you'll be able to see whether those problems are a systemic problem within your organization, or whether you have, one person or two people who just need some retraining on that, and you retrain them. You want to make sure, that you use your EMR system to the extent that you can to verify that all that information that your payers require is a required element of the note. The note won't convert without that information, right? So you want your stop and start time to be a requirement. You want, you can't really control the length of the narrative, but the narrative has to be there. They can't forget to put something in the plan section, right? What are we going to do? Whether it's continue to follow the treatment plan or talk to the BCBA about a new behavior, or, we need to create more materials for this client, going forward, or, so-and-so mastered this goal, talk to the BCBA about what I do next. To make sure that, every section of the note is filled out, that the note is signed after the session ends. And again, if the session ends at 2:01 and you sign your note at 2:02, you didn't write that whole note in 1 minute. You need to, as part of your internal monitoring process, you need to watch for that, because those are the things you should be doing. And again, just because something is incorrect, and then you catch it, you fix it, you move forward. I mean, it's sort of your own little ongoing performance improvement plan, right? Because we all want to do better, and when we know what we need to do, we make those changes and we do it better. It doesn't necessarily mean, just because you had a handful of session notes without start and stop time, it doesn't mean you were trying to commit fraud, because you don't have that intent. You have to intend to commit fraud. You're going out there, you're either being really reckless in ignoring red flags, or you're going out there with the intent to do something wrong. That's fraud. Making a mistake is not fraud. So it's scary, and the word gets, tossed around a lot. And I have people say to me, I discovered that I had, 5 session notes for this one child, for an RBT who's since left us and they didn't sign the notes. Did I commit fraud? I'm like, no, you're asking me if you committed fraud. Like, no, you didn't. You made a mistake, and let's figure out how we're gonna fix that. And the other thing that people should realize too, and it is okay to use this, is that you do have, particularly with federal payers and your Medicaids, your TRICARES, and your state Medicaid, there are self-reporting obligations if you discover a big billing problem, right? Self-reporting is a scary thing to do, but it's an important thing to do because it's really something that impacts if a False Claims Act case is brought against you under state or federal law. One of the things that they may take into account is whether you self-reported, right? You came out, you were like, this was a problem, and here's what I'm going to do to fix it. You may owe money back. That's the scary part, right? You may owe money back. But if you hide it, you're not showing particular goodwill toward wanting to resolve the problem. But the other thing is, if you catch something early enough, you may be able to file a corrected claim. And if you're with a payer like TRICARE, you have something like a year, I believe, to file a corrected claim. So you've got, it may be shorter with some other funders, but that corrected claim is essentially a de facto self-report in a way, without having to do anything formal in self-reporting. And I have had people self-report to TRICARE and to Medicaids, and that's it. And again, they could come back and audit you at some point later. They may contact you later. But oftentimes, if you make that self-report and you pay back, or they offset, against future claims, sometimes that's all that happens. And then you've done it. And you're not sitting around wondering when they're going to discover. And again, you have, especially with the, your TRICARES, your Medicaids, you have an obligation to self-report those. Now, you have to quantify what it is you're self-reporting. You can't just be like, oh my gosh, I found this billing error. What am I going to do? You have to figure out how much that billing, I'm going to self-report. Well, what are you going to self-report? Because you don't even know how much it is. You're just going to self-report that there's some nebulous problem. Is it $500 or is it $5 million? Like where is it along the way? Because just because you discover even a problem, oftentimes what I see with people is they discover a problem with one person. Maybe it's like one BCBA. There's a problem with their client files. And then I say you have to look broader. You have to look at your other people to see if this is a systemic problem or one person. And oftentimes it's isolated. And then you make this up, but you don't know how big your problem is till you quantify it. So that's another important thing to keep in mind in this whole process.
I mean, I could continue asking questions, but I think we can end it there. And unless there's something that we missed that you just want to make sure everybody knows.
I don't think so. I think we've covered
a lot.
We covered a lot of ground.
Amazing.
Absolutely. And so we'll put your contact information in the show notes so everyone can reach out to you. And yeah, I really appreciate you helping us when we had an ABA practice. And I really appreciate you coming on the show and helping so many other people. I'm just like, yeah, you're awesome. We love you. You're great. And thank you for what you do.
Well, I love you guys too. And I love what you're doing for the community as well. I mean, great advice and services to people. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. All right. We'll see everyone next time.